Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Magnus.
Good morning. We're so glad you could join us today for another Bible study in the Word, a Bible study ministry sponsored by First Christian Church of Johnson City, Tennessee. Dave Roberts and I are here again to chat our way through another important passage. We've been talking about the mercy of God and the justice of God, and the ways in which those concepts are played out in the teachings of Jesus and in our lives. So here we go with another one. We have another parable.
It's a great one too.
We've had several parables in this series here, and we're going to have some more in the weeks that lie ahead. This is an important parable. I think once again we need to set the context in which Jesus told this story, so we can understand its full impact. Mm-hmm. We're in Luke chapter 16 today, which puts us immediately following Luke chapter 15.
That's the lost and found chapter.
The lost and found. It's not just the lost chapter, is it?
No.
We sometimes call these the lost parables, and then you wonder, where are they?
Yeah.
Well, we know where they are because they were found. Let's see. We had the lost sheep. Mm-hmm. Lost coin.
Lost coin and the lost sons.
Lost sons, good point, because the elder son is about as big a mess as the younger son. Well, Jesus has told those three parables, and Luke has recorded them, and right before this parable. Mm-hmm. And it's important to note that those lost and found parables were told in the context of a controversy between Jesus and the Pharisees.
Criticizing him for eating with sinners.
Yeah, and you'll find this in Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. Jesus is reaching out to the common people. And that word sinners there, Pharisees even called common people sinners, even if they couldn't identify a specific sin. They just assumed they were sinners.
Yeah. Because
they didn't attend to the rituals and the study of the law to the degree that the Pharisees did.
They didn't follow all the rituals, and that put them on the bad list.
All the traditions of the elders and all that.
But Jesus, in talking of those things that were found, talked about how the angels in heaven rejoice. Mm-hmm. It's important to God.
Yeah. So Jesus tries to change the perspective of the Pharisees regarding God's love for all people in those three parables. And now, as we move into chapter 16, Jesus maintains that interest in trying to explain to the Pharisees and explain to the people about the Pharisees in contrast to God's will for all people. And in chapter 16, we've got a fascinating a pair of parables here. One at the beginning, one at the end. We're going to look at the second one. Mm-hmm. But right in the middle is yet another reference to Pharisees.
Yes.
Take us through that.
Okay, both parables begin with the phrase, "There was a rich man." And that is verse 1, and you find it again in verse 19.
Yeah.
But in verse 14, it says, "The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, 'You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God.'" So they were exalting themselves because of wealth, and it was the outward thing that they thought was so important. And Jesus, again, emphasizes it's the heart that matters to God.
Yeah. The fact is, in Judaism, it was very common to assume that wealth, along with other blessings, what we usually call blessings, was a sign of God's good favor. Mm-hmm. And that poverty or sickness or other things like that, were a sign of God's disfavor, God's direct disfavor. Jesus takes that teaching and turns it on its head.
Oh, yes. Like in John 9, when they came to a man who was born blind, the immediate assumption was either he sinned or his parents sinned.
Right.
Jesus said that's not the issue at all.
No. And so I think we still hang on to that assumption today.
The
don't
attitude
you?
is there.
It's hard to shake that. Our definition of blessing is so often connected to wealth and health, and our assumption is even to this day that if people face illness or poverty or some kind of discomfort, that at least may be their own fault, that they brought on themselves through some kind of sin. And Jesus just rejects that. So what we have here is a beautiful, I don't know, well, we want to call it a sandwich or an Oreo cookie or something, but we've got a rich man parable.
Rich man, the manager.
And the dishonest manager at the beginning of chapter 16, and then another rich man parable, the one we're going to look at today. And right in the middle is the bologna. It's a bologna sandwich, or the tuna fish. And that is this reference to the Pharisees.
That they loved money, and the impression was that money is all important, and if you have money, everything's great. Which our society tends to do too.
Yeah, and that the goal of life is to justify yourself, to make yourself look good, not seek the good of others.
Yeah.
Well, that's all in the context of the parable that we're discussing today. So that is really very helpful. One other background matter I wanted to mention before we read our text is that the parables of Jesus almost always involve this kind of reversal, kind of shift. You know, you got a little tiny grain of mustard seed. Look what a big, useful plant it becomes. You got a little pinch of yeast. Look at the impact that it has. And Jesus continually surprises us. Look at the harvest from that good seed in the parable of the sower. And who would have thought that you don't pull out the weeds? You know, that's a surprise. And we're about to get a big surprise
in
this parable as well. Well, let me read it. It's Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 19. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to him, "If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead."
It's a powerful parable.
That is a very powerful, with a great conclusion there, isn't it? A frightening conclusion in some ways. Well, one of the most unusual things about this parable is that it has a named character.
Yes, Lazarus.
The only time, Lazarus. And before we wonder too much about why he's a named character, I think we can quickly and confidently point out that this name has a meaning which has a symbolic purpose.
It comes from Eleazar.
Okay.
And that means God helps.
Yeah. Eleazar was the son of, well, there are many Eleazars in the Old Testament, but one prominent one was the son of Aaron, who became the high priest. Yeah. And again, now, what does it mean?
God helps.
God helps. So El is God, Ezer is help. God helps.
Which you don't see in his lifetime, but you see that God did help. But not in this time.
Yeah. And that's that may be, we may have just made the main point of the story right there.
Yeah.
That Jesus is calling on all people to put their trust in God. In contrast to the rich man of the parable, who put his trust in fine things and luxury, and in contrast to the Pharisees, who, as you pointed out in verse 14, just a few verses earlier, put their trust in money and in their reputation. Yeah.
But this man Lazarus was pitiful, and the rich man apparently was totally oblivious and unconcerned.
Yeah. So God may help eventually, but the rich man certainly did not help. No.
Right.
And that there's a strong contrast here between his wealth. We have this business of purple. Remind us why purple cloth was so expensive.
Oh, it was a very extensive process and very difficult to make the purple cloth, and it was indicative of great wealth or even royalty. Lydia was a seller of purple, which meant she dealt upscale merchandise. And was,
probably a wealthy woman herself,
yes,
fairly wealthy, yeah. Purple dye came from shells from the sea, and the process was difficult. Linen was the finest, softest cloth. Most poor people couldn't afford linen. They wore some kind of homespun, rough, burlappy type things. And we see that his luxury was boundless every day.
Every day.
This was his life every day. In contrast is Lazarus, God helps, who we learn a number of things about him. He had a skin disease of some kind.
Covered with sores.
Covered with sores. He was utterly poverty-stricken. He was a beggar, and there are two words in Greek for poor. One is the working poor, someone who had a job but couldn't make ends meet. This is the other word that means utterly destitute, beggar.
And somebody laid him at the gate.
Right. That's the third thing that you don't see all that obviously. He is infirm. I don't know if he's lame, crippled, what, but somebody else has to carry him to a place where he's likely to get a handout.
Yeah, but he was longing to eat the food from the rich man's table. Doesn't say he got it. He longed for it.
Right. Now, the last sentence of verse 21, even the dogs came and licked his sores. In Greek, that sentence begins with the word but the dogs came and licked his sores, which I think sets up an interesting contrast between the rich man's refusal to give any aid or comfort to Lazarus, but the dogs did give him some comfort. Their saliva might have had some soothing effect, aloe effect on his skin sores. All right, I think I've grossed everybody out, so we can.
But they both die.
They both die. That's right.
And yet the contrast again is evident that when the beggar died, the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man died and got buried.
Yeah,
that's it.
So there are no angels here, but the description of their very contrasting lifestyle continues, doesn't it? References to torment, agony, isolation, cut off for the rich man, and emphasis on companionship, at the side, compassion for Lazarus. There's the reversal that we were talking about.
This parable probably shouldn't be taken as a literal description of heaven.
Right.
It's a parable, and this thing about Abraham's side and the chasm and so forth probably is more of the popular view, like we talk about Peter and the pearly gates and people coming to the pearly gate and all this, looking at the books. We have this popular conception of what it's going to be like, and it's more like Jesus was picking up on that popular conception to talk about the difference.
Yeah. We should resist the temptation here to use passages like this to make some map of heaven or a map of hell, which some people have done. We should resist that temptation. For one thing, it takes the focus off the point of this parable.
Exactly.
Which is the call to compassion for the poor.
Yeah.
And to be lovers of God's priorities rather than our own possessions. And so any attempt to say, so what's hell like or what's heaven like, is really to shift the focus away from the point.
Jesus' emphasis was on living life here.
Yeah.
The picture of what comes after is to emphasize how you live here.
Exactly. Good point. By the way, the word that the NIV translates pity in verse 24 is the word mercy. We saw that in a recent lesson. Jesus quoting Hosea, I desire mercy,
not sacrifice.
Not ritual sacrifice. And here we see the same thing. This is an ironic plea, isn't it? Begging Abraham to commission Lazarus to show mercy to him.
Right. And he's still wanting Lazarus to be the servant.
Yeah.
He still considers himself to be superior and Lazarus to be the inferior, the servant.
He's the one to be bossed around and sent on errands.
Sent off on errands,
Yeah. So he hasn't changed his mind at all, isn't he? And that reminds me of a book that I know we've both read that's really very influential. C.S. Lewis was one of the great spiritual writers of the 20th century, and all of his books are meaningful and helpful. But there's one little thin book called The Great Divorce. And it's not about divorce.
No, I know.
Which fooled me for many years. It's about the chasm.
Yes.
It's about the great chasm that's referred to in verse 26.
And the choices we make here are still choices to be made eternally.
Yeah. There's a fascinating passage in that book, which is kind of a spiritual fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
About a bus tour from hell to heaven, and people can get on board and travel to heaven and take a little day trip.
See what it's like
there. And you get the impression that they're even given the option to stay if they want, kind of, but no one does.
They don't.
They just all go back to torment, to the Shadowlands, as it were. And I'm always reminded of that fascinating fantasy depiction of C.S. Lewis's because of what you just said. He hasn't changed.
Yeah.
He's still trying to manipulate circumstances and other people to his own benefit.
To fit himself.
Yeah. So just like the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, who always tried to put themselves in the best position.
Impression before people.
Yeah. Well, verse 25 is where these another request, the explanation of Abraham to his request. And I did want to point out that Abraham uses a very thoughtful word here. Instead of son, it's my child, which is a very tender word. So Abraham is speaking tenderly to the rich man, but he also explains the reality of the situation as well.
And the rich man is never named, although historically people referred to him in Latin as the rich man, which is a Dives or Dives.
Yeah, Dives. So some of our viewers may have heard him referred to by that name. It's not a name, but the word rich man has been turned into a name by some people.
But Abraham says child.
What about this chasm in verse 26. How are we to understand that? We've already agreed that we're not picturing the geography of heaven.
But there's a separation. There is a difference between being with God and being away from God.
Yeah. And the rich man created his own chasm between himself and Lazarus in this life. I mean, Lazarus is lying right outside his door.
Yeah. Couldn't go in and out the wall gate without seeing that beggar.
Yeah.
And he longed for food he apparently never got.
But there's a psychological, a sociological, an economic, perhaps even a spiritual chasm. He probably looked down on him as a sinner, the way Pharisees look down on sick people as sinners. So he created that chasm in his own lifetime, even though he's lying right outside his doorstep. And that has created in eternity a chasm which he's unwilling to cross, at least. I don't know if he's unable, but he's certainly unwilling. Yeah. Verse 29 is fascinating. Send somebody to warn my family.
Yeah, he's got 5 brothers.
Yeah.
And he wants Lazarus to go, but he wants to warn
step and
them.
fetch it. And Abraham's response is amazing. They have Moses and the prophets. All they have to do is listen to them.
Yeah.
The fact is that the law, what we call the law of Moses, and the teachings of the prophets are full of instructions from God regarding the care of the poor and the disadvantaged, widows, orphans, poor, immigrants.
Yeah.
It's just everywhere.
Aliens. And so many times people will say, "Oh, I don't read the prophets; they're too hard to read or too hard to understand." It's often printed in a poetic way, but the prophet's message is so similar to what Jesus said in his teachings about caring for the poor and recognizing that it's not a matter of going through certain ritualistic exercises in a day of worship. It's that plus how you live daily and how you treat people and your daily conduct that's your relationship with God.
Yeah. And it's not as if that had been missing from the law, so the prophets had to supply it.
No.
What the prophets did was to highlight those aspects of the law that had been overlooked by so many of the Israelites throughout the centuries, and say, look, if you read the law properly, you'll see that God cares for the poor. And if God cares about the poor, then God's people better care about the poor, in contrast to the Pharisees and this rich man. So I think that's what is behind that statement. They have Moses and the prophets. They should know how to care for the poor. They don't need someone
And
else.
we have to be careful that we don't create chasms, because sometimes it's uncomfortable to be around some people, and we're not at ease as much in the presence of some people. But if those people are important to God and they're going to be in the kingdom of God eternally, we'll be with them, and we need to learn to be with them now. But that's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. Well, verse 30 is the rich man's attempt to twist Abraham's arm one more time. He says, look, you've got to send Lazarus, because if someone like Lazarus rises from or comes back from the dead and testifies to them, then surely they will repent of their self-centered, money-focused lives. And Abraham's response to that is just unbelievable.
If they don't listen to the prophets and Moses, they won't be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. And you see him talking about his own resurrection.
Oh, yes. This is, when Jesus tells this parable, he's foreshadowing his own resurrection. One of the striking things about the gospel story is that even after the resurrection of Jesus, there was not a flood of converts people who came in faith to him. I mean, there were hundreds, but there weren't millions.
There was more opposition from the leaders. As the book of Acts unfolds, we find the apostles being arrested, put in prison, punished, try to get them to be quiet about it.
About the resurrection.
Exactly.
Precisely about the resurrection.
Yeah.
And when they were hauled before the Sanhedrin, they were ordered to quit preaching about the resurrection.
Exactly.
In specific, those were the words.
Yeah.
And so the Pharisees were not converted by someone rising from the dead.
Yeah.
They were hardened.
Yeah. You were mentioning the similarity of the name, Lazarus, and the brother of Mary, Martha, named Lazarus, whom Jesus brought back from the dead, resuscitated, and questioning whether that made people convinced.
Yeah. Now, first, let's establish the Lazarus of this parable and the Lazarus, brother of Mary, Martha, have no connection.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, no human connection. Right. This is a parable. This is a made-up character, and that was a real person. Yeah. So, no distinction. But that Lazarus, according to the Gospel of John, was raised from the dead by Jesus. So the question is, okay, we've got a resurrection. Did that bring about a great swell of faith in
That was
Jesus?
chapter 11 in John. Chapter 12 in John is where the leaders of the Jews decide, we've got to kill this man before we lose our place.
So Abraham's response is right on, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look, if they haven't obeyed the law of God, the prophets of God, they're not going to be convinced even if someone rises from the dead.
Yeah.
And the raising of Lazarus in the Gospel of John is proof that that is true.
It didn't convince people.
It didn't convince people. In fact, it hardened them and was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in leading to the opposition.
The determination they've got
that led to the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Well, this is fascinating, and what an amazing reversal of fortunes is described in this parable. I just think about what do we take away from this parable. One of the things that strikes me is the importance of repentance. Sometimes we talk about the importance of faith and the importance of baptism as steps of response to what God has done in Christ, and repentance sometimes takes a lower seat. But the importance of not only initial repentance, but a lifelong repentance, I think is brought to our attention by this passage.
Continuous recognition that we may be in the rich man's role, ignoring people of need and presuming because we have plenty that we're the most important people.
Yeah.
And that's not the case.
Yeah. And this name, which we started by talking about, is so beautiful, Lazarus. It reminds us that, for one thing, we all need to recognize that we are Lazarus in need of God's help and not sufficient on our own, no matter how rich or influential we may be. But also to remember that there are lots of Lazaruses around us, and the way in which God helps them, is often through us. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us in this discussion of Jesus' wonderful teaching and this beautiful parable. I hope you have a wonderful week and can join us again next week as we continue our study in the Gospels.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.